The sound of vacuum cleaner humming through the marble hallways of the Morrison mansion had become as familiar to Maria Santos as her own heartbeat. For 3 years, she had cleaned every corner of this Silicon Valley fortress, her calloused hands polishing the same surfaces where tech mogul David Morrison sealed million-dollar deals. At 34, Maria carried the weight of 2 worlds on her shoulders. The gleaming American dream she scrubbed clean every day, and the harsh reality of being an undocumented immigrant fighting to give her 12-year-old daughter Sophia a better life. She never imagined that the very floors she mopped would soon become the stage for her greatest humiliation, and ultimately, her most spectacular triumph. David Morrison stood 6 feet tall in his custom-tailored suits, commanding respect in boardrooms across Silicon Valley. His tech empire, Morrison Digital Solutions, had made him worth over $50 million by age 42. He lived in a world where people like Maria were invisible furniture, useful when needed, forgotten when not. His wife, Jennifer, spent her days at charity luncheons and spa appointments, treating Maria with a casual indifference reserved for hired help. Neither of them suspected that the quiet woman who cleaned their toilets and folded their clothes was quietly absorbing every detail of their lives, every conversation, every business call that David took while she dusted nearby. Maria's English was better than they assumed, and her mind was sharper than they could ever imagine. That fateful Tuesday morning in October started like any other. Maria arrived at 6 a.m., her cleaning supplies organized in the same careful pattern she'd maintained for years. Sophia was already at school, unaware that this would be the last normal day of their lives together for a very long time. As Maria began her routine in David's home office, she noticed scattered papers around his usually pristine desk. Her employer had been drinking heavily the night before, empty whiskey glasses, and the smell of alcohol still lingered in the air. What she saw among those papers would change everything. Bank statements showing offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, receipts for massive cash transactions, and most damning of all, detailed records of how David had been hiding millions from the IRS for over 5 years. Maria's hands trembled as she processed what she was seeing. Her survival instincts told her to clean around the papers and pretend she'd seen nothing. But her mother's heart thought about Sophia's future, about all the immigrant families like theirs who played by the rules while people like David cheated the system. She made a decision that would haunt her for months, but ultimately save her life. Using her phone, she quickly photographed the most incriminating documents. She had no plan for what to do with the evidence, but something deep inside told her to preserve it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart race as she shoved the papers back into their original positions and resumed dusting. David Morrison walked into his office that morning with the confidence of a man who owned the world. He barely glanced at Maria as she worked, treating her like an automated cleaning device. But something felt different. His papers seemed slightly disturbed, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was wrong. Paranoia crept into his mind. Had someone been going through his private documents? The thought of his carefully constructed tax evasion scheme being discovered sent ice through his veins. He spent the morning reviewing every paper, every file, trying to determine if anything was missing. When he found everything in place, he convinced himself it was just his hangover making him paranoid. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Over the next few days, David's behavior changed. He became hypervigilant whenever Maria was in his office, sometimes standing in the doorway watching her work. Maria felt his eyes burning into her back as she dusted and vacuumed. But she maintained her usual quiet efficiency. She had worked too hard to build trust with this family, to let paranoia destroy her job. Sophia needed the stability, needed the money Maria earned from cleaning the Morrison mansion. But David's suspicion was growing like a cancer, fed by his guilt and fear of exposure. He began setting small traps, moving objects slightly to see if they'd be disturbed, leaving fake documents in plain sight to test if Maria would show interest. His paranoia was consuming him, and Maria was about to become its victim. The trap was sprung on a Friday afternoon when Jennifer Morrison discovered her diamond bracelet missing from her jewelry box. It was worth $15,000 and had been a gift from David for their anniversary. Jennifer was certain she'd left it in her bedroom, but after tearing apart the entire room, it was nowhere to be found. When David heard about the missing bracelet, His paranoia exploded into certainty. The cleaning woman had been acting suspicious lately, and now valuable items were disappearing. In his mind, it all made perfect sense. He didn't bother to consider that the bracelet might have fallen behind furniture or been misplaced during Jennifer's own carelessness. He had found his scapegoat. Maria was finishing her work in the kitchen when David stormed in, his face red with rage and accusation. "Where is my wife's diamond bracelet?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Maria looked up from scrubbing the countertop, genuine confusion written across her features. She had seen the bracelet many times while cleaning Jennifer's room, but she couldn't remember noticing it that day. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Morrison," she replied in her careful English. "I haven't seen any bracelet." But David had already made up his mind. In his paranoid state, her confusion looked like guilt. Her careful English sounded like calculated lies. He was convinced he had caught the thief who had been violating his privacy and stealing from his family. "Don't lie to me," David shouted, stepping closer to Maria until she backed against the kitchen counter. "I know you've been going through my office, and now you're stealing from us. How long have you been robbing us blind?" His accusations hit Maria like physical blows. After 3 years of faithful service, after never taking so much as a piece of fruit from their kitchen, she was being branded a thief. Tears stung her eyes as she tried to defend herself. "Mr. Morrison, please, I would never steal from you. This job means everything to me and my daughter." But her pleas only seemed to fuel his rage. He saw her tears as manipulation, her mention of Sophia as an attempt to gain sympathy. There would be no mercy. Jennifer Morrison appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. When she saw Maria, cornered by her husband, some part of her felt uncomfortable. Maria had always been reliable, trustworthy, almost invisible in the way good help should be. But the missing bracelet was worth more than Maria made in 6 months, and David's certainty was infectious. "Maybe we should just call the police and let them sort this out," Jennifer suggested, though her voice carried doubt. That suggestion sealed Maria's fate. David's paranoia transformed into righteous fury. "Yes, that's exactly what we'll do. Maria Santos, you're fired, and you're going to jail for theft. And since you're here illegally anyway, you'll be deported back to whatever hellhole you crawled out of." The words hit Maria like a physical assault. In that moment, her world collapsed. Not only was she losing her job, but David's threat about deportation was real and terrifying. As an undocumented immigrant, she lived in constant fear of exactly this scenario. If she was arrested, she would be separated from Sophia, sent back to El Salvador with nothing, while her daughter disappeared into the foster system. "Please, Mr. Morrison," she begged, her voice breaking. "I didn't take anything. Please, don't do this. My daughter needs me." But David was beyond reason. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. He wanted to see her break, wanted to watch her pay for daring to violate his privacy, for making him feel vulnerable in his own home. Within 20 minutes, 2 police officers arrived at the Morrison mansion. David met them at the door with the confidence of a man used to being believed without question. He was wealthy, white, and articulate, everything that carried weight in Silicon Valley society. Maria was brown, poor, and spoke with an accent, everything that made her automatically suspect. "Officers, we have a theft situation," David explained smoothly. "Our housekeeper has stolen a $15,000 diamond bracelet from my wife's jewelry box. We want to press full charges." The officers looked at Maria, who stood in the kitchen still wearing her cleaning apron, tears streaming down her face. To them, the scenario was straightforward. Rich family, poor, immigrant housekeeper, missing expensive jewelry. They didn't need Sherlock Holmes to solve this case. Maria tried to explain her innocence, but her broken English and obvious terror worked against her. When the officers searched her purse and cleaning supplies, they found nothing. But David insisted the bracelet was hidden somewhere else, perhaps at her home, perhaps already sold. "She's been acting suspicious lately," he told the officers. "I think she's been casing our house for weeks, planning what to steal." The officers nodded sympathetically. They'd seen this story dozens of times before. Desperate immigrant steals from wealthy employer, gets caught, claims innocence. It was a familiar narrative, that fit their preconceptions perfectly. When they asked for Maria's identification and discovered she couldn't provide legal documentation of her status, the case became even clearer to them. The handcuffs felt cold against Maria's wrists as the officers led her to their patrol car. Through the kitchen window, she could see David Morrison standing with his arms crossed, satisfaction written across his face. This was his justice, swift, brutal, and absolute. Jennifer stood beside him, looking less certain, but saying nothing to stop the process. As Maria was placed in the back of the police car, her only thought was of Sophia. Her daughter would be getting out of school in a few hours, expecting to find her mother at home with dinner prepared and homework help ready. Instead, Sophia would find an empty apartment and a future filled with uncertainty. The car pulled away from the Morrison mansion, carrying Maria toward a nightmare that would separate her from everything she loved. At the police station, Maria's situation went from bad to catastrophic. When Immigration and Customs Enforcement was notified of her arrest, her fate was sealed. She would be processed for theft, and regardless of the outcome, she would be deported as an undocumented immigrant. The public defender assigned to her case was overworked and uninterested. Maria's story was just another file in an endless stack of similar cases. When she tried to explain that she was innocent, that she had never stolen anything, her lawyer barely looked up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, they found you in the house. You had access to the jewelry, and you can't prove your innocence. My advice is to plead guilty to a misdemeanor and hope for leniency. The system designed to process people like Maria quickly and efficiently, not to seek truth or justice." Sofia Santos came home that afternoon to find their small apartment empty and her mother nowhere to be found. At 12 years old, she was mature enough to understand that something terrible had happened. When the police arrived that evening to take her into protective custody, her world shattered completely. The foster care system swallowed her up like it had thousands of other children whose parents had been deported. She was placed in a temporary home with strangers, told that her mother had been arrested for theft and would be returning to El Salvador. Sofia screamed that her mother was innocent, that she would never steal anything, but no one listened to the desperate pleas of a scared child. The bureaucracy moved forward with mechanical indifference, separating families and destroying lives with paper-pushing efficiency. 3 days after her arrest, Maria Santos found herself on a deportation flight to El Salvador, carrying nothing but the clothes she wore and a heart broken into a million pieces. The charges against her had been dropped due to lack of evidence. The bracelet was never found, and there was no proof she had taken it, but her immigration status made the criminal charges irrelevant. She was being removed from the country regardless, banned from returning for 10 years minimum. As the plane lifted off from American soil, Maria pressed her face against the small window and wept for the daughter she was leaving behind. She had no idea where Sophia was, no way to contact her, no knowledge of when or if they would ever see each other again. The land of opportunity had become her prison and then her exile. El Salvador felt like stepping into a past life that no longer fit. Maria had left this place 8 years earlier with nothing but dreams and determination. Now she was returning with even less, no money, no connections, and no hope. The small rural town where her grandmother had lived felt like another planet after 3 years in Silicon Valley. The heat was oppressive, the poverty was crushing, and everywhere she looked, she saw the reasons why she had risked everything to take Sophia to America. Her grandmother's old house was still standing, barely, with a leaking roof and walls that hadn't seen paint in decades. This was what David Morrison had condemned her to, a life of subsistence in a place forgotten by progress and prosperity. The first few months were the darkest period of Maria's life. She survived on odd jobs and the charity of distant relatives who barely remembered her. Every night, she lay on her grandmother's old bed and cried herself to sleep, thinking about Sophia. Was her daughter safe? Was she being treated well in foster care? Did she hate her mother for abandoning her? The questions tormented Maria, but she had no way to get answers. International calls were too expensive, and even if she could afford them, she didn't know how to navigate the American child welfare system from El Salvador. She felt like a ghost, existing but not truly alive, going through the motions of survival while her heart remained trapped in a foster home 3,000 miles away. But Maria Santos was built from stronger material than her circumstances suggested. Her grandmother, Elena Santos, had been a woman of remarkable resilience who had raised 6 children alone after her husband died in the Civil War. Elena had always told Maria that their family land was special, blessed in ways that weren't immediately obvious. "Mia," she would say, "this land has secrets that will reveal themselves when the time is right. Never sell it. Never abandon it, no matter how worthless it seems." Maria had dismissed these words as the superstitions of an old woman, but now, with nowhere else to turn, she began to pay attention to the land she had inherited. Maybe somewhere in these rocky hills and dry creek beds lay the key to reclaiming her life. The property that Elena Santos had left to Maria covered nearly 200 acres of seemingly barren hillside about 30 miles from San Salvador. Local farmers avoided the area, claiming the soil was too rocky and the water too scarce for successful crops. But Maria noticed things that others missed. There were strange mineral deposits in the creek bed that ran through the property, unusual rock formations that seemed out of place, and areas where the vegetation grew in peculiar patterns. She had no scientific training, but 3 years of cleaning David Morrison's home office had exposed her to countless conversations about technology, mining, and natural resources. She remembered David talking about lithium batteries, about how electric cars were going to revolutionize transportation, about how certain minerals were becoming more valuable than gold. Maria's breakthrough came when she met Dr. Carlos Mendoza, a geology professor from the University of El Salvador, who was conducting research on mineral deposits in the Region Dos. Dr. Mendoza was a man in his 50s who had studied in the United States and understood the global market for rare minerals. When Maria approached him about testing her grandmother's land, he initially dismissed her as another desperate landowner, hoping for miracles. But something about her intensity, her specific questions about lithium and rare earth elements, made him curious enough to agree to preliminary tests. What he found in those soil and rock samples would change both their lives forever. The test results were extraordinary. Maria's grandmother's land sat atop one of the largest lithium deposits ever discovered in Central America. The mineral concentrations were so high that Dr. Mendoza had to run the tests 3 times to believe the numbers. Lithium was the critical component in electric car batteries, and with the global push toward renewable energy, demand was exploding. Major car manufacturers were desperate to secure lithium supplies, and deposits of this quality were incredibly rare. Dr. Mendoza estimated that the value of the lithium beneath Maria's rocky hills could exceed $2 billion. The worthless land that local farmers avoided was actually a treasure trove that could fund a small nation's budget. But having valuable resources and being able to extract them were 2 completely different challenges. Maria had no money for mining equipment, no connections to international markets, and no experience in the complex world of mineral extraction. Traditional banks wouldn't even consider lending to an unemployed deportee with no collateral. Dr. Mendoza explained that developing a lithium mine required tens of millions in initial investment, environmental permits that took years to obtain, and partnerships with companies that had the technical expertise to process the raw materials. To most People, the obstacles would have been insurmountable. But Maria Santos was not most people. She had been underestimated her entire life, and she was tired of letting other people's limitations define her possibilities. Maria's first asset was her grandmother's jewelry collection, not valuable by Silicon Valley standards, but worth enough in El Salvador to fund the initial legal work needed to secure mining rights. Elena Santos had been a woman of simple means, but she had saved and invested in gold jewelry over decades, viewing it as insurance against economic instability. These pieces, which had seemed like sentimental trinkets, became the foundation of Maria's business empire. She sold them strategically, using the money to hire lawyers who could navigate the complex process of obtaining mining permits from the Salvadoran government. Every gold bracelet and silver necklace was converted into paperwork, legal fees, and government filings that slowly but steadily established Maria's legitimate claim to the mineral rights beneath her land. The second phase of Maria's strategy required something more valuable than money information. During her 3 years in David Morrison's house, she had unconsciously absorbed a graduate-level education in business, technology, and international commerce. While dusting his desk, she had overheard countless phone calls about supply chains, market dynamics, and strategic partnerships. While cleaning his computer room, she had seen presentations about emerging technologies and global investment trends. David had never imagined that his invisible cleaning woman was cataloging every detail of his business operations, learning the language of corporate deal-making from one of Silicon Valley's most successful entrepreneurs. Now, that accidental education became Maria's secret weapon. Maria understood that the key to success lay not in selling raw lithium, but in controlling the supply chain and creating strategic partnerships. She spent months studying the global lithium market, identifying the companies that needed reliable sources, understanding the geopolitical factors that affected pricing. She learned about Chinese companies that were aggressively expanding their renewable energy operations, about European manufacturers who were desperate to reduce their dependence on unstable suppliers. Most importantly, she learned that success in this industry required thinking 10 moves ahead, building relationships that could weather economic and political storms. David Morrison had taught her these lessons without realizing it, and now she would use his own playbook against him. The breakthrough came when Maria contacted Chunwei, a representative of Sunset Mining Consortium, a Chinese company that specialized in developing mineral resources in emerging markets. Chun had been searching for lithium deposits in Latin America for over 2 years, frustrated by corrupt local officials and unreliable partners. When Maria reached out with detailed geological surveys and clear legal documentation, Chun was initially skeptical. Most such contacts turned out to be scams or overly optimistic assessments. But Maria's presentation was different. She demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, spoke knowledgeably about processing technologies, and most importantly, had the geological data to back up her claims. Chun agreed to visit El Salvador to evaluate the opportunity personally. The meeting between Maria Santos and Chunwei took place in a small restaurant in San Salvador. Two worlds colliding over coffee and Chun expected to meet another desperate landowner with unrealistic expectations. Instead, he found a woman who understood his business better than many of his corporate partners. Maria presented a development plan that demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking. Phased extraction that would allow early cash flow to fund expanded operations. Environmental protection measures that would satisfy international standards. And most innovatively, a profit-sharing structure that aligned long-term interests. Chun was impressed not just by the quality of the lithium deposits, but by Maria's business acumen. Here was a partner who understood that successful mining required more than just digging holes in the ground. Sunset Mining Consortium agreed to a joint venture that gave Maria a 40% ownership stake in exchange for the mining rights and her active participation in management. The deal was structured to provide her with immediate cash flow through advance payments while preserving her long-term wealth through equity ownership. Within 6 months, heavy machinery was arriving at the remote site that had been dismissed as worthless farmland. Maria stood on the hilltop where her grandmother used to collect herbs, watching bulldozers and excavators transform the landscape into an industrial operation. But this wasn't just about extracting minerals from the earth. It was about extracting justice from a system that had tried to bury her alive. The lithium extraction process moved forward with remarkable efficiency. Chunwei's company had developed innovative processing techniques that could extract higher purity lithium using less water and energy than traditional methods. The deposits in Maria's land were so rich that initial production exceeded all projections. Within 80 months, the mine was producing lithium carbonate that was being shipped to battery manufactories in China, Korea, and Germany. Maria found herself traveling between El Salvador and major cities around the world, negotiating supply contracts and building strategic partnerships. The deportee, who had been branded a thief, was now courted by executives from Tesla, BMW, and Ford who needed her lithium to power their electric vehicle ambitions. But Maria's transformation went far beyond financial success. She established the Elena Santos Foundation, named after her grandmother, which provided legal assistance to immigrant families facing deportation and separation. She hired teams of lawyers who specialized in reuniting children with their parents, understanding better than anyone the horror of bureaucratic family destruction. The foundation also provided business training and microloans to women in rural El Salvador, helping them develop economic opportunities that might prevent them from having to choose between poverty and family separation. Every success story validated Maria's belief that dignity and justice were not luxuries reserved for the wealthy, but basic human rights that required constant defense. As Maria's wealth and influence grew, she never forgot her ultimate goal: reuniting with Sophia and settling accounts with David Morrison. Private investigators hired by the Elena Santos Foundation tracked Sophia through the American foster care system, documenting her placement history and legal status. What they discovered broke Maria's heart but strengthened her resolve. Sophia had been moved between 3 different foster homes, struggling with depression and behavioral problems that stemmed from the trauma of sudden separation from her mother. She was academically gifted but emotionally wounded, carrying the scars of a system that had failed to protect her from unnecessary suffering. Maria was determined to not only bring her daughter home, but to ensure that no other family would endure the same injustice. The private investigators also provided detailed reports on David Morrison's business operations, and what they revealed was deeply satisfying to Maria's sense of justice. Morrison Digital Solutions was struggling financially, hurt by increased competition, and David's own poor his paranoia and control issues had driven away key employees and important clients. The tax evasion scheme that Maria had discovered was still ongoing, but the IRS was beginning to notice irregularities in his filings. David had managed to avoid immediate consequences for destroying Maria's life, but his chickens were coming home to roost in ways he couldn't yet see. The man who had wielded his wealth and power like weapons was about to discover that karma was patient, but thorough in its accounting. By the end of a second year, back in El Salvador, Maria Santos had been transformed from a deportee into a businesswoman worth over $500 million. Her lithium empire was expanding beyond mining into battery manufacturing and renewable energy storage systems. She owned properties in San Salvador, Mexico City, and Shanghai. International business magazines profiled her as one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in Latin America. But all the wealth and recognition in the world meant nothing without Sophia. Maria had rebuilt her life, but she couldn't truly live it until her family was whole again. The time had come to return to the United States and reclaim what had been stolen from her. Maria's legal team, led by immigration attorney Rebecca Rodriguez, had been working for months to establish the groundwork for her return to the United States. As a legitimate businesswoman with substantial investments in American companies, Maria qualified for an investor visa that would allow her to enter the country legally. The criminal charges that had been the pretext for her deportation had been formally dismissed, and her new status as an international entrepreneur opened doors that had been slammed shut when she was branded as a thief. But Maria wasn't just planning a visit, she was planning a conquest. Every legal filing, every visa application, every business registration was a chess move in a larger strategy to systematically destroy David Morrison's life, just as he had destroyed hers. The global supply chain disruptions of 2023 created the perfect opportunity for Maria to begin her campaign against David Morrison. As one of the world's largest lithium suppliers, she now had the power to influence which companies received critical materials and which ones were left scrambling for alternatives. When Morrison Digital Solutions tried to secure lithium batteries for a major client contract, they discovered that the usual suppliers were experiencing mysterious shortages. Prices were skyrocketing, delivery schedules were slipping, and David Morrison found himself unable to fulfill commitments that were crucial to his company's survival. He had no idea that his supply chain problems were being orchestrated by the woman he had destroyed 3 years earlier. Maria's return to Silicon Valley was carefully choreographed to maximize psychological impact. She arrived in a private jet, accompanied by a team of assistants and security personnel. Her first stop was a luxury hotel in Palo Alto, just 15 minutes from the Morrison mansion where she had once scrubbed toilets. The media attention surrounding her arrival was significant. A rags to riches story about the deportee who would become a billionaire mining magnate. Local newspapers and business journals requested interviews, fascinated by the dramatic transformation of the anonymous immigrant who had built an empire from worthless land. Maria granted selective interviews, always mentioning her focus on clean energy and family values, never directly referencing her previous life as a housekeeper. She wanted David Morrison to discover her new identity on his own. David Morrison first learned about Maria's return while reading the San Jose Mercury News over his morning coffee. The headline read, "Salvadoran mining heiress brings clean energy empire to Silicon Valley," and the accompanying photo showed a sophisticated woman in an expensive business suit, standing in front of a massive lithium processing facility. Something about the face looked familiar, but David couldn't quite place where he had seen her before. As he read the article, learning about Maria Santos and her remarkable rise from poverty to billions, a terrible recognition began to dawn. The woman's background story mentioned working in the United States before returning to El Salvador, and suddenly the pieces clicked into place. His former housekeeper, the thief he had deported, had somehow become one of the wealthiest women in Central America. The realization hit David Morrison like a physical blow. The quiet woman who had cleaned his house for 3 years, who had scrubbed his floors and washed his dishes, was now worth more than he could ever dream of being. Worse, she was in Silicon Valley with the resources and motivation to destroy him. David's paranoia, which had been dormant since Maria's deportation, exploded back to life with unprecedented intensity. He spent hours researching Maria's business empire, studying her partnerships and investments, trying to understand how she had achieved such impossible success. The more he learned, the more terrified he became. This wasn't just about money. Maria Santos now had the power to crush him completely, and David knew he had given her every reason to want revenge. Maria's first direct move against David Morrison was surgical in its precision and devastating in its impact. Through a series of shell companies and proxy purchases, she began acquiring the debt obligations of Morrison Digital Solutions. David had leveraged his company heavily to fund expansion, and much of that debt was held by banks and investment firms that were happy to sell the loans to Maria's representatives at a discount. Within 6 months, Maria Santos controlled over 60% of David Morrison's business debt. She now had the legal authority to call in those loans, force asset sales, or push the company into bankruptcy whenever she chose. David was completely unaware that his former housekeeper had become his largest creditor and held his financial future in her hands. The psychological warfare began with small, untraceable actions designed to make David question his sanity. Contracts that seemed certain would be mysteriously canceled at the last minute. Key employees would receive unsolicited job offers from competitors at precisely the moments when David needed them most. Technical problems would plague his computer systems, causing delays and cost overruns that ate into already thin profit margins. David began to suspect that someone was systematically targeting his business, but he had no idea who or why. The paranoia that had led to Maria's downfall now consumed him completely. He hired private investigators to identify his mysterious enemy, never suspecting that the architect of his misery was the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant household help. Jennifer Morrison watched her husband's deterioration with growing alarm and irritation. David had become obsessed with business conspiracies, spending hours analyzing every setback for signs of sabotage. His drinking had increased dramatically, and he frequently woke up in the middle of the night in cold sweats, mumbling about enemies and plots. Jennifer tried to convince him to seek therapy, but David insisted that his problems were real, not psychological. The stress was affecting every aspect of their marriage, and Jennifer began to wonder if she had tied herself to a man who was losing his mind. She had no memory of the housekeeper who had been deported years earlier, and David's references to that thief seemed like the ravings of a paranoid mind. Sofia Santos, now 15 years old, had survived 3 years in the American foster care system through sheer force of will and the memory of her mother's strength. She had been placed with the Johnson family in Oakland, a kind couple who provided stability and support while she waited for news about her mother. When immigration attorney Rebecca Rodriguez contacted the Johnsons about beginning the reunification process, Sophia's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. The tears she had held back for 3 years poured out as she learned that her mother was not only alive and fighting to bring her home, but had become one of the most powerful women in international business. The scared 12-year-old who had been torn from her mother's arms was about to be reunited with a woman who commanded respect from presidents and CEOs around the world. The reunion between Maria and Sophia took place at San Francisco International Airport on a Tuesday afternoon in November. Maria arrived surrounded by security personnel and media representatives, but all of that fell away when she saw her daughter walking through the arrival gate. Sophia had grown tall and beautiful in their years apart, but her eyes still held the hurt and uncertainty that came from being abandoned by the system that was supposed to protect her. When they embraced, both women cried with the intensity of 3 years of suppressed grief and desperate longing. "I never stopped fighting to come back to you," Maria whispered in Spanish. "I never stopped believing you would," Sophia replied. In that moment, the most important victory of Maria's campaign was complete. Her family was whole again. But the war against David Morrison was far from over. Maria had spent 3 years building the weapons she needed for her final assault, and now she was ready to use them. The first phase of her endgame began with a coordinated media campaign that exposed the connection between her current success and her previous life as Morrison's housekeeper. In carefully orchestrated interviews, Maria revealed how she had been falsely accused of theft and deported, separating her from her young daughter. She provided documentation showing that the charges had been dropped for lack of evidence, but that the deportation had proceeded anyway. The story of an immigrant woman's spectacular rise after being destroyed by a wealthy employer captured public imagination and generated enormous sympathy for Maria while casting David Morrison as a villain who had abused his power to destroy an innocent family. The media attention surrounding Maria's story prompted investigative journalists to examine David Morrison's business practices more closely. What they discovered was a pattern of exploitation that went far beyond his treatment of domestic workers. Former employees came forward with stories of wage theft, discrimination, and hostile working conditions. Environmental groups revealed that Morrison Digital Solutions had been dumping toxic waste in violation of federal regulations. Most damaging of all, the IRS launched a formal investigation into his tax returns based on anonymous tips that provided detailed evidence of his offshore accounts and unreported income. David watched in horror as his carefully constructed public image crumbled under the weight of scrutiny that Maria's story had triggered. The financial walls began closing in on David Morrison from multiple directions simultaneously. Maria used her position as his largest creditor to demand full repayment of loans that he couldn't refinance due to his damaged reputation. The IRS froze his accounts pending their investigation, making it impossible for him to access the cash needed to service his debts. Major clients canceled contracts rather than be associated with a company under federal investigation. Morrison Digital Solutions, which had been worth over $50 million at its peak, was now hemorrhaging money and facing imminent bankruptcy. David found himself trapped in a financial vice that tightened every day, with no way to escape the consequences of his own actions. The final confrontation came when David Morrison was forced to put his mansion up for sale to raise cash for his legal defense. The house where Maria had scrubbed floors and been humiliated was now a distressed property that needed to be sold quickly at below market value. Through another shell company, Maria Santos submitted the winning bid, purchasing her former workplace for less than half its original value. The irony was perfect. The woman who had been dragged from this house in handcuffs was now its legal owner. But Maria wasn't content with symbolic victory. She wanted David Morrison to understand exactly who had destroyed his life and why he had deserved every moment of his downfall. The meeting was arranged through David's bankruptcy attorney, who informed him that the new owner of his home wanted to discuss terms for him to remain as a tenant until he could find alternative housing. David arrived at his former mansion, now Maria's property, expecting to negotiate with another faceless investor. Instead, he found Maria Santos waiting for him in his old living room, sitting in the same chair where he had once signed deals worth millions of dollars. She was dressed in an elegant business suit that cost more than he used to pay her in a month, surrounded by lawyers and assistants who treated her with the deference reserved for royalty. The transformation was so complete that David needed several seconds to process what he was seeing. "Hello, David," Maria said calmly, her voice carrying an authority that made him flinch. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." David Morrison, the man who had once wielded his wealth and status like weapons against the powerless, found himself face to face with a woman he had tried to destroy. Every word she spoke was measured and controlled, but underneath the professional demeanor was a current of barely contained fury that made David's hands shake. He tried to summon the arrogance that had once made him feel untouchable, but looking at Maria, surrounded by evidence of her success, he felt only terror and a growing recognition that he was completely at her mercy. "You destroyed my family," Maria continued, her voice never rising, but carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You separated me from my daughter based on a lie. You used your wealth and privilege to crush someone who had never done you any harm. Now you're going to learn what it feels like to be powerless." David wanted to protest, to claim that he had only been protecting his property, but the words died in his throat. The evidence of Maria's innocence was overwhelming, and the consequences of his actions were sitting before him in the form of a woman who now controlled his fate. He had created his own nemesis through his cruelty and paranoia, and now she held all the cards. Maria's terms were simple and utterly humiliating. David Morrison would be allowed to remain in the house as a caretaker, responsible for maintaining the property and grounds. His salary would be minimum wage, exactly what he should have been paying the immigrant workers he had exploited over the years. He would live in the basement apartment that had once housed visiting staff, while Maria converted the master bedroom into her West Coast office. Every morning, David would put on a janitor's uniform and clean the same floors where he had once walked as master of his domain. The man who had treated Maria as invisible hired help would now be invisible hired help himself, subject to the same lack of dignity and respect he had shown to others. The federal investigation into David Morrison's tax evasion concluded with criminal charges that left him facing years in prison and millions in penalties. His assets were frozen,